Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into the story behind one of the world's most incredible constitutions. But this isn't just about dusty legal documents. Oh no. This is a 350-year saga of trade, power, and revolution. It's the story of how a private company became an empire and how the fall of that empire gave birth to modern India.
So it really makes you wonder, right? How on earth does a history that long, we're talking centuries of corporate rule, imperial power, and a massive independence movement, how does all of that get boiled down into one single foundational document? Well, that's what we're here to find out. All right, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll see how a trading company sort of accidentally laid the groundwork for an empire. Then we'll watch the British Crown step in and take over. After that, the demand for self-rule becomes unstoppable, leading us right to independence and the massive job of drafting a constitution from scratch. So, our story doesn't start with a king or a conqueror. It starts with a bunch of merchants. This is part one, from trade to territory. We're about to see how the East India Company went from just a business to basically running the show. It all kicks off with this, believe it or not, the Charter of 1600. This single piece of paper gave the East India Company, a private business, remember, the power to make its own laws, to govern its settlements. Think about that. A private company with the power of a state. That one decision completely changed the course of history. And this set up a really fascinating power struggle. On one side, you had the East India Company, which was acting more and more like its own government. And on the other side, you had the actual British Parliament back in London, which, slowly but surely started to realize it needed to get this company under control. This tension is at the heart of the first part of our story. You can actually see this power shift happening over decades. In 1773, the Regulating Act was Parliament's first real attempt to put its foot down. Then, about a decade later, Pitt's India Act tightened that grip even more. And by 1833, with the Charter Act, they created an All India Legislature. Lawmaking was now officially centralized in London, not in the company's boardrooms. Okay, that brings us to a massive turning point in our story. Let's move on to Chapter 2. The Crown takes control. This is where a whole new era of direct rule begins. After 250 years, just let that sink in for a moment, the East India Company's rule came to a sudden and dramatic end. The final straw was the huge Indian Rebellion of 1857. That event convinced the British government that a trading company just couldn't be trusted to govern a subcontinent anymore. This wasn't just a small policy change, it was the end of a corporate empire. So, what does transfer to the crown really mean? Well, it meant the company was out. All the power, all the territory, all the decision-making. It was now directly under the control of the British government. The middleman was officially gone. But here's the twist. Right as British rule became absolute, the very first seeds of Indian involvement were planted. In 1861, for the first time ever, Indians were brought into the lawmaking process. Then, in 1890, they introduced limited elections. And then came 1909 and the Minto-Morley reforms, which did something hugely important. It created separate electorates for Muslims, and that decision, wow, that would deeply, deeply shape the politics of the region for decades. Of course, those little steps towards involvement weren't nearly enough. So the story now shifts from what the British were willing to give to what the Indian people were starting to demand, which brings us to Chapter 3, the demand for self-rule. And this quote just perfectly captures the feeling at the time. The British rule could not meet the aspirations and just demands of the Indians. This growing feeling of dissatisfaction, well, it became the fuel for a powerful political movement that swept across the entire subcontinent. And that dissatisfaction didn't just stay a quiet feeling. It exploded into action. An anti-British campaign for local self-government started gaining serious momentum. The demand was no longer just for a seat at the British table. It was for an Indian table, run by Indians. And all that pressure? It actually worked. The Government of India Act of 1919 was a huge deal, giving Indians a voice in every branch of government. But the real game changer was the Act of 1935. It was so detailed, setting up things like provincial autonomy and a federal court, that it basically became the blueprint for almost 2/3 of India's final constitution. This momentum just kept building and building, leading us to the final dramatic chapter of British rule. This is Chapter 4, independence and the assembly, where everything starts to happen very, very quickly. I mean, the end came with breathtaking speed. In 1946, a British mission suggests elections for an assembly to write a new constitution. By December of that same year, that assembly is already meeting. A few months after that, Lord Mountbatten shows up with the final plan, and by August, it was a done deal. And then came the day. On August 15th, 1947, after hundreds of years of struggle, power was officially, formally, and finally transferred to Indian hands. The long era of British rule was over. But with that freedom came an absolutely immense responsibility. And that brings us to our final chapter, drafting India's future, the incredible, monumental task of creating a constitution for a brand new nation. So who were the architects of this thing? Well, you basically had two key groups. First was the Constituent Assembly, led by its president, Dr. Rajendra Prasad. This was the big forum for all the debates and the final votes. And within that group, you had a special drafting committee, chaired by the brilliant Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and their job was to write the actual text. This timeline shows that final sprint to the finish line. What's amazing is that the assembly started its work even before independence was official. By 1948, they published a draft for the public to discuss, which is such a cool democratic step. The final version was adopted in late 1949, and then on January 26, 1950, the Constitution of India officially came into force, marking the birth of the Republic. So, from a corporate charter in 1600 to a republic in 1950, what a journey. A constitution born from centuries of evolution, of struggle, and of hope. It really leaves us with one final thought, doesn't it? What does it take to maintain a document like that, to keep it alive and relevant for all the centuries to come?